Let me tell you what I hate about old houses, because I lived in a certified nightmare of one until I was 19. It's the locks. Not the cheap, modern deadbolts, but the ones you inherit. The ancient, heavy-duty cast iron bars fitted with huge, polished steel keys. They'd been there in our Victorian as long as I could remember, specifically on Grandpa Cyrus's bedroom door. Just part of the aesthetic, like the peeling, dark wood wainscoting that ran halfway up every wall, or the phantom smell of old fireplace ash that never left the West Wing. The biggest difference between our family and other families wasn't the lock, but the ritual. Every night, after dinner, it happened. Grandpa Cyrus, a tall, unmoving relic of a man who looked exactly like the New England granite we were built upon, would fold his linen napkin carefully, place it beside his perfectly cleared plate, and rise with a tiny, soundless sigh. He'd thank my mother, Sarah, for the meal, pat my father, Thomas, carefully on the shoulder as he passed, and then pause at my chair. He'd incline his head slightly, a small, knowing smile crinkling the corners of his impossibly blue eyes. For a split second, his face would lose a decade, almost mischievous. Then, his eyes would flick to his right temple, and discreetly, his index finger would tap the area right behind his ear. It was a secret, odd little acknowledgement they'd shared since I was too young to notice. Then he'd move. His tailored slippers scuffed the floor with a rhythmic, predictable drag that even the clatter of the kitchen couldn't drown out. Dad would drop his own full napkin, his gaze already distant, and follow. He was already jangling the chain of a thick steel lock key, its teeth worn dark by decades of ritual. Once Grandpa stepped inside the room, always perfectly on a timetable of 9:55 p.m., Dad would close the ridiculously heavy oak door. The massive key would turn twice in the cast iron bracket locks until they sealed with a sound that didn't click, but rather a slow, heavy, resounding clunk-clunk. Sometimes, I'd see Dad press a shoulder hard into the wood, testing the fit, before he'd sigh, return the keychain to his pocket, and we'd finish clearing the table. No one talked about it. I never thought to ask why an outside mechanical lock was necessary for the frailty of age, and neither did they offer an explanation. As a kid, I'd assumed, like everyone who visited, that it was an early sign of dementia, a gentle necessity. The house was full of absurd rules, after all. At university, my roommates would call the house a Gothic prison, after hearing snippets of these routines. I'd shrug. It's just family stuff. Cyrus is eccentric. The locks are just old brass. I kept silent about the knowledge that those locks were definitely not brass, but heavy, forged iron. I lived a simple life in denial. Grandpa eats. Grandpa goes to bed. Dad locks the door. That night, the night it all ended, the simplicity broke like a cheap vase. Dinner was a thick, smoky black cod stew that Mum prepared, heavy with thyme, savory, and wonderful. Grandpa ate with his usual meticulous care, using the delicate antique fork like a surgical instrument. Halfway through the meal, though, he didn't lower his utensil. He paused, his gaze fixed on a small patch of air directly between him and Mum, completely motionless. A sudden, soundless tension seized the room. Then I noticed it. I swear I saw a distortion in the air. Not sound, but a visual ripple, a microsecond distortion shimmer, a heat haze clinging above his right hand, a perfect, barely perceptible translucent geometric artifact only visible for a breath, and then gone. He frowned, not sadly, but with stark, cold finality, and slowly raised his hand to his head, his fingers immediately tapping exactly where the shimmering had been, right behind his right temple. Across the heavy linen tablecloth, I watched my parents exchange a single, silent, terrible look. It wasn't confusion, or even fear, it was knowledge. A weary, devastating recognition that cut all the air from the room. "Liam, sweetheart, more bread?" Mom asked, but her voice was tight. Dad simply picked up his water glass, his jaw rigid. Normalcy crashed over the incident like a collapsing wave, but the salt was already stinging my eyes. The silent message they'd exchanged was clear: it's happening. The vessel is failing. Right at 9:55 p.m., Grandpa Cyrus placed the final bite of stew down without swallowing. He straightened his shoulders. He gave his thanks to Mom and Mom returned it, her hand hovering, but not touching him. He patted Dad's shoulder, and I remember how his fingers seemed to sustain contact for a beat too long, before turning to me. He paused. He removed, with painstaking slowness, his heavy, silver pocket watch, the old repeater he'd carried since the service, a piece of immaculate clockwork. He folded my trembling fingers around its cold, worn housing, meeting my eyes with his chillingly calm blue gaze. "You notice things, Liam," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "You understand more than you choose to show." Then, with his ritual nod, Grandpa Cyrus walked down the hall and the door closed. The slow, deep clunk-clunk followed, heavier than usual. I stood there, the heavy pocket watch now burning with an unholy coldness in my palm. The memory of the shudder, the acceptance in my father's eyes, and that strange tap on the temple was too much. This wasn't safety, this was containment. For the first time, my rational, analytic mind crumbled under the sheer weight of undeniable dread. I couldn't sleep. The ticking of Grandpa's watch, now resting awkwardly beneath my pillow, sounded less like a mechanism and more like dry soil being scraped by tiny fingers. I fought the primal terror for hours, my college-trained brain desperately arguing with the ancient part of my sanity that knew exactly what I needed to do. Near 2 a.m., the fear won. I forced myself out of bed. I was going to find the master key I knew existed, and I was going to open that lock. I had to know why we locked him in. The iron key was never left on the table. It had always been hidden. I walked into my parents' dark room. Mark wasn't a man of cheap tricks. The security was internal, ceremonial. I went straight for the heavy pendulum case of the ancestral grandfather clock that dominates their end of the hallway. The last object every father who has carried this specific burden has owned. The pendulum swung lazily, quietly. I traced my fingers along the heavily oiled wooden edge of the casing until I found the barely perceptible hinge. It opened. Rested upon a bed of ancient, soft indigo velvet was the second master key, a grotesque piece, much older and heavier than the one my father carried, bearing a coat of arms from centuries past. It was cold with the accumulated dread of generations. As I slipped that massive key onto the ring with the one from the watch, a shiver of profound guilt and terror seized me. Guilt, because I was about to violate a lifetime of enforced silence. Terror, because I was about to become an eyewitness to the terror my father had concealed for decades. I crept to the door. The cast iron lock felt rough, almost sticky, demanding a silent respect. I knelt, pushing the key into the mechanism, feeling the teeth slot naturally. The lock turned not with a click, but with an immense, mechanical crunch of old bone and stressed metal. I slipped soundlessly inside. The air in the room didn't smell of old lavender. It smelled of cold electrical ozone and recently incinerated earth. The heavy, expensive silence pressed down on me, choking the breath in my throat. Moonlight filtered weakly through a sheer curtain, casting the room into fractured shadows and light. Grandpa Cyrus was sitting upright in his bed, just as he had been 1,000 times before. But his eyes were wide open, looking past me, staring into the far, high corner. And they were faintly, unnaturally, radiating a cold, pure, unwavering blue light. "You should not have cut the ritual. The vessel is failing, Liam," he rasped, the voice coming not from him but seeming to echo from the air surrounding him. "The static has no room to contain itself. You rushed its preparation." My blood turned to pure acid. The room twisted, the corners of the wall seeming to vibrate against my periphery. Then, from the grandpa's mouth, instead of flesh or coils of sinew, came a single, vibrating, thin beam of that terrifying, absolute blue light. It didn't waver. It traveled straight and silently across the darkened room. It focused on the antique oak dresser, and where the light hit, the wood did not burn. It sublimated. It simply vanished, briefly replaced by a tiny, terrifying splash of fused neon green plastic where the light concentrated the paint. Then a deafening sound erupted through the door behind me. Bam! The oak cracked wide on its hinges and my father, Thomas, burst in. His face wasn't shocked. It was a pure mask of devastation and preparedness. In his hands he gripped the heavy family tool, an ancient, black, forged iron sledgehammer, wrapped tightly in dry oilcloth and duct tape. Father had known. He charged past me without a whisper. He knew precisely which angle to approach. The blue beam shifted towards him, briefly kissing his shoulder and leaving only a faint scorch mark on his dark flannel fabric. He ignored it. With a strangled, agonized cry ripped straight from his chest, he raised the ancient weight. He brought the sledgehammer down. Not once, but twice. The blow landed precisely on the lower, thickest part of Grandpa Cyrus's skull. The sound was not wet, but a deeply final, sickening crush of dry density and iron force. The horrifying blue light did not scream. It simply died. Like pulling the plug on a monstrous, energy-draining machine. The stillness was instant, absolute, terrible. My mother, Sarah, appeared in the doorway seconds later. She knelt carefully, never looking at the mess around the headboard. In her hands was a heavy, blackened bowl containing a strange, cold, gray mixture of ash, salt, and what looked terrifyingly like small steel filings. She sprinkled the filings meticulously around the edges of the bed, sealing the space. My father dropped the hammer. He didn't look at Dad's body. He only looked at Mum, his expression a testament to duty, grief, and exhaustion, a century of fear in his eyes. Later, in the cold, echoing kitchen, the chair where my grandfather used to sit lay empty. The silence was heavier than the old sledgehammer. Through the shattered, unrepaired door in the hallway, the faint gleam of the still unlocked iron mechanism sat waiting. Dad finally raised his head from his buried hands. "It's the lineage of the host, Liam," he choked out, his voice pulverized by grief. "It isn't a demon, it's the static. It binds to the eldest son before the current vessel fails, to be contained until its next harvest. We are the jailers and the vessel. It keeps it from infecting the world, at the cost of our sanity and lives." He stood up, swaying slightly. He walked to the kitchen clock, but didn't look at the time. He smoothed his hand, just as Grandpa Cyrus did, meticulously over the dark fabric of his flannel, right behind his ear. I watched as Mum silently took the massive ring of keys, the original set, now hers, from his hand. She didn't look back at me. She simply followed her husband down the echoing hall. I sat there, frozen. I heard the scuff of the slippers, the familiar shut of the heavy oak door. And then, the new owner of the burden twisted the master keys. Clunk. Clunk. The sound resonated through the house. The static had not died that night. It had only changed rooms and changed skin. Then, with an awful clarity that eclipsed all the pain, I remembered the silver pocket watch, tucked cold and heavy into my own jacket pocket by my grandfather's ritual tap on his right temple. I raised my hand to my own head, and my finger instinctively traced the spot near my ear. And from that ancient pocket watch, tucked tightly against my skin, I suddenly, distinctly heard a new sound, the rhythmic, faint, almost inaudible scrape of metal, like tiny, dedicated gears beginning to turn. It was the sound of my next inevitable century.